Thank you everyone for being here. It's really nice to see folks. We have quite a few folks today. Everyone joining. This is our February meeting of Passive House, Massachusetts. So we're doing this in coordination with MCAN, with Mass Climate Action Network. And they'll be speaking here in a bit, introducing themselves. And we invited a lot of other groups to join as well. So we have, in addition to some of our typical Passive House Mass members who join a lot of these monthly sessions, we have a lot of new faces tonight from other organizations across the state. Some folks who have been working on advocacy around a net zero policy or electrification for Passive House, and some folks from other places. I know we have some folks from developers, and we have some other people from other agencies. So it's nice to have everyone here. We're going to have a lot of discussion tonight, so a chance for kind of all of you to participate and weigh in. But tonight we're talking about Passive as sort of the platform for net zero, electrification, healthy, resilient buildings. Before I get too far, I did want to mention some upcoming events. So I'll just mention that real quick. For those who don't know me, I'm Aaron Gunnarsson. I'm with Passive House Massachusetts. We put on a lot of events. So we do a monthly meeting at this time, second Tuesday of every month. But then we have other events throughout the month that we kind of put on as well. So coming up in February here, we have these 3 sessions. Next week is one on ventilation, comfort, and VRF systems. That's a lunch and learn featuring a representative from Swegan and a representative from DXS Engineering talking about those systems. That's next Thursday. The week after that, we're promoting this event, but we're not putting it on, but it's put on by Passive House Accelerator, is a Passive House Retrofit Summit. So look for details on that on our website as well, so you can see what they're doing. And then the week after that, on the 23rd, we're having a session featuring Bronwyn Berry talking about factoring in electrification. So one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about tonight is electrification. It'll come up, but we'll have a full session on that in a few weeks. All of these you can register for on our website, phmass.org, and find out all the info there. But this is what we're going to cover tonight. So we're going to do some quick welcome intros, which I've started. Then I'm going to pass it off to Rebecca from MCAN and to Sarah from MCAN to talk a little bit from their perspective. And then we'll go into a short discussion of what we mean when we say passive is the platform for net zero. About 5 minutes of just setting the stage for what we mean when we say that phrase and what this whole meeting is about tonight. And then we're going to jump into really the core of the meeting, which is discussing various advocacy pathways for net zero and for Passive House and how they fit together. We have a few different speakers who will kind of highlight a few different areas. And then after that, we're going to go into group discussion. So we'll break up into breakout rooms and kind of discuss. We have a few questions and a few talking points, but otherwise we'll talk kind of about these topics, and then we'll come back together and sort of have some closing discussions and maybe some takeaways from all the different groups. And that's really what we're going to cover here tonight. No, I was just looking at the chat room. Sorry. You can use it to discuss things throughout the conversation. And right now, thank you for putting that. So thank you. So here we go. We're gonna jump into things. I'm gonna turn things over to Rebecca. If you would like to do an intro here to talk a little bit about MCAN. We've been great to partner with them kind of throughout our existence, really, but really the last couple of years, we've done a lot of things with them. Rebecca came and presented to a Passive House meeting when we did one in person a year or so ago. So it's been a great group to work with, and they've been leading a lot of the charges on net zero and Passive House fitting into that. So I want to give them a few moments to kind of talk about their work and how they fit into this whole picture.
Great, thank you, Aaron. It's wonderful to see all of you here tonight. As Aaron said, my name is Rebecca Wintrick Knox, and I am our Better Buildings Campaign Director with the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. And we are really focused on tackling climate change from the grassroots up. We're a chapter-based nonprofit with over 60 chapters representing over 100 towns and cities in Massachusetts. We have 2 major campaigns focused on cleaning up our municipal light plants and making sure that all new construction is built to the healthiest, safest, most efficient standard possible, while also focusing on retrofits with a specific attention to affordable housing. I'm going to talk a bit about my campaign work in more detail later on tonight. For now, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah Dooling, our Executive Director.
Great, thank you. And Aaron, just so you know, I've been admitting people into the meeting, so we can keep tabs on that. Excellent. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Sarah, and I have interacted with several of you, but certainly not all of you. And as Rebecca mentioned, MCAN, we are increasingly moving into the affordable housing retrofit space. And some of you have been on calls with myself as we have been working on a couple of different legislative priorities focusing on retrofits. Erin, can I share my slides now for my comments, or do we have Rebecca do that first?
We'll do the comments here in a few moments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, part of what, oh, excellent, Jane Carbone is here tonight. Part of what MCAN is also focusing on very explicitly, which I will cover in more detail in a moment, is really responding to Governor Baker's misinformation campaign about the net zero stretch code as choking the production of affordable housing, new construction. And so that is something that we have been very focused on over the past couple of weeks. So with that, Erin, shall I start my slides? I'm sorry, Erin.
Sorry, I was on mute again for myself. So let's hold off for a moment. What we're going to do is I'm going to have Michelle Appigian here talk a little bit about the passive as a platform concept, and then we'll go into these advocacy pathways and have Rebecca and Sarah and our own Hank Keating talk a little bit about a few different subjects. So Michelle, if you'd like to actually take it away, I'll turn it over to you for about 5 minutes.
Sure. And I have no slides, which is a rarity for me. I'm Michelle Appigian. I'm an architect with Icon Architecture, for those who don't know me. A passionate advocate for passive house and housing for everyone, and equity across the board. And what I want to just sort of frame, because it's sort of a theme that we're going to be touching back toward throughout the rest of the year in terms of the conversations that we'll be having and the experts that we'll be bringing to the conversation, is how we see passive house and net zero is sort of inextricably linked. And frankly, passive house is the essential first step, whether or not one is able to achieve net zero. And so I think to do that, it's important to say a couple things about what net zero means, because net zero is a big buzzword and it sounds great, and it can be great. But what it means is that for every amount of energy you're using on your site, you're creating equal amount of energy, so that on par as a net, you're not using any energy off of the planet. And that's awesome. Sounds great. And it's a really good goal. But I think it's important to understand how we break that down. So the first thing is that you have to reduce your energy use. That's just the very first thing that you have to do. And passive house is a beautiful platform for that. It really targets energy explicitly, and as a byproduct has just unbelievable benefits and indoor environmental quality. And if you were looking at a more holistic standard like LEED, those two things alone are like half of the equation for all the points that one could possibly accumulate through LEED. So let's target energy. By doing that, we will target air quality. And when we've done that, we've set ourselves up, and then we're ready to see how we can move to net zero. And to be even more explicit around that, when we target energy, it means that we are assuming airtightness, and we are adding the right amount of insulation. It's those two things, airtightness and insulation. And once we've done that, we can figure out, because now we've got a thermos, right? We've got to do ventilation. So we've got an envelope that's doing all that work for us before we've even built a system, then we add ventilation, and then and only then can we talk about heating and cooling. And at that point, if our engineers trust us, thank you to those who are on the call today, because not everyone does, then we're going to get the right sized heating and cooling system for the project. And that's really what it's all about. So first, reduce the energy that your building needs to use. Passive House is the starting point. Then, if you can get off fossil fuels, and this is a big one, got to get off fossil fuels. So heating and cooling, that's not that hard. Ventilation, no problem. Fossil fuels are hard when we talk about hot water. And so that's a conversation that we're going to have down the road as an organization in one of these sessions. But hot water is the nut that we got to crack. But once we've got enough of fossil fuels and it's all electric, then you have to add renewable. And the question, and it's a big question right now, it's a question before our governor, it's a question all over the place, is where does that renewable need to live? And I firmly believe that every project should make itself available to offer renewable, if it even seems remotely sensible. That's not expensive, but not every project can actually generate the amount of renewable for all sorts of contextual reasons. Could be the site, could be the height, could be the density, could be the load, yeah, all kinds of things. So first, we reduce energy with Passive House. Second, we get off of fossil fuels by figuring out the hot water equation. Usually, that's the nut that we're cracking. And third, we add renewable energy as we can, where we can, plan for it. But we're not always going to be able to hit net zero on site. And that's really the point. We'll maybe collectively through our grid, maybe collectively through green purchasing, but not on-site generation that offsets all of the density that we're promoting for all kinds of great reasons. So low energy first. That's why Passive House is the platform. Net zero is a great goal, and we don't know that that's feasible in all contexts. And so we want to be clear that best way to be able to feasibly accomplish that is by starting with that low load profile that the Passive House mandates, and then figuring out what is left to augment, to offset. And that's really, that's the platform for us for the year. Net zero is big in the ether. It's in all kinds of legislation that's out there. And net zero means different things to different people, and it's not always feasible on site. But what is definitely feasible on every site is a low energy building designed intentionally. And Passive House is an excellent platform to help us get there.
Great. No, I think that was a perfectly concise, description of what we mean by Passive House as a platform for net zero and why we're having this meeting tonight to talk about it. There's been a lot of advocacy over the last year at the state level and even in local communities that many of you are from, discussing everything from zoning to local special permitting processes to updating the building code. So we're going to take kind of a core part of this meeting, maybe in the next, I think we have 40 minutes set aside for this, and talk about some of those advocacy areas, to talk about the work that's been happening so far, and to talk about sort of how Passive House fits into this going forward. So we're going to have Rebecca speak on one of these issues, Sarah on one, and then Hank Keating on another. So at this point, Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can share your slides if you'd like and kind of go through, you can start with some of these advocacy pathways.
Great, thanks, Aaron. I will, let's see. Sorry, guys, bear with me just a moment here. Oops. Okay, here we go. So I'm just going to be walking folks through what MCAN's Better Building Codes campaign has been really centered on over the past 2.5 years. And Sarah's going to be getting into a bit more depth after me in outlining what other implications of our campaign work is focused on and avenues for legislative and regulatory input. So as folks on this call know, the reason that we need better building codes is pretty simple. It's because better buildings have really significant benefits for health, safety, equity, and indoor air quality, in addition to climate. And codes are a somewhat obscure but really critical tool that determine how our new buildings get built. So in Massachusetts, we have 2 building codes, which is actually pretty uncommon in the US. We have the base building code, which sets the floor for new construction, and we have the stretch energy code, which sets the ceiling for new construction. And the base code comes from the International Energy Conservation Code, while the stretch code is set by the Board of Building Regulations and Standards. And over the past couple of years, MCAN has been working with our partners on campaign work that really seeks to improve both of these codes while making the processes that determine them more accessible, more democratic, and transparent. So in fall of 2018, we began working with Sierra Club, MAPC, and NEEP to reach out to voters who were eligible to participate in the voting process that would set our 2021 International Energy Conservation Code. And this was done as part of a national effort to register more pro-climate voters who hadn't participated in the past. So we were focused on educating municipal staff and employees that were concerned with health and safety and climate, but weren't necessarily code experts on helping them register to vote and register their departments to vote. And we were really successful in this outreach effort. We were able to recruit over 500 voters to participate in the 2021 IECC vote, which, as you can see, secured a major efficiency boost. So from between 2012 and 2018, we had maybe a 2% efficiency boost for the entire IECC. And then from the 2018 to 2021 code, it's determined to have between an 8 and 14% efficiency leap for both the residential and commercial codes. And Massachusetts is statutorily required to adopt this code within a year of its national passage. However, I do want to flag that there has been some conservative pushback to this effort of making the vote more accessible. So national industry lobbyist groups have put forward a motion to the International Code Council that would actually that would eliminate the governmental member voting process and would put the code in the hands of a small hand-picked group that the ICC would appoint. So MCAN has been working with our communities and with other municipalities across the country and advocating to the ICC that we must protect this vote, that it's really crucial in making our code democratic and making sure that people who are enforcing the code have a say in how it gets developed. We should know what happens in the next few weeks, and if you're interested in getting involved, we have a few different advocacy actions that I'm happy to direct folks towards. And as we were doing this IECC work, we became increasingly aware of how much our chapters and our communities are held back by the current stretch code. So while the IECC has had some efficiency gains in the past decade or so, our stretch code really hasn't changed since it was first passed in 2008. So we've been identifying this development of a net zero stretch code as a major climate goal that would allow communities across the state to do their climate work, as well as promote healthier and safer new construction. And here is my attempt to represent the different decision makers that are involved in trying to change the stretch code process. It's definitely been a bit of a convoluted effort, and I know many of you have been involved in advocating at various levels. So as you can see, the BBRS circled here is really prominent in this process. They're the board that is appointed by the governor and is responsible for promulgating all building codes. So we've been advocating directly to the BBRS, having communities from across the state come in and testify why a net zero code is important to their communities, as well as having legislators, health professionals, as well as many of you testify to the board. But the BBRS has been pretty reluctant to move on this of their own accord. So MCAN also worked with 2 climate champions in the State House at the beginning of the last session, Representative Gouveia of Acton and Senator Comerford of Northampton were both great in taking on this bill and actually making sure that it was included in the final climate package, the roadmap bill that many of you are familiar with, that was sent to the governor's desk for the second time just a few weeks ago. So this bill would direct the Department of Energy Resources to actually write and publish a net zero stretch code within a year of the bill's passage. However, Governor Baker has sent back amendments that would strip out this net zero language and change this to a high-performing stretch energy code. And to Michelle's earlier points, we know that we can't just, although energy efficiency is a great place to start, it's not the end point for net zero. We have to also consider electrification and renewables. So we're continuing to advocate to the legislature and to the governor for the retention of this net zero stretch code language in the final climate bill. And then lastly, I want to lift up some of the great work that industry advocates such as yourselves have been involved in. So after the BBRS came back to us and said, we need code language to review, MCAN supported MAPC, NEEP, Built Environment Plus, and the Boston Society for Architecture in actually writing a model net zero stretch code, which is called the Energy Zero or EZ code. And it's a visionary commercial code that would apply to all new construction. Right now, we know that the best way to support the EZ code is to support the net zero stretch code provision in the climate bill. And that if the climate bill gets passed, we're well positioned to support DOER in incorporating elements of the EZ code into the final net zero stretch code that they would be adopting. But we know that all new commercial doesn't address all buildings. And so that's why we've been working on also furthering an EZ residential code, which Hank will speak about a little bit later. So that's all for me. You can see my email, and I encourage folks to reach out if you have questions or want to get involved. And I believe the slides will be sent out afterwards, and we're also recording tonight. Great. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. And I just want to emphasize that I thought Michelle's comments were really concise and very articulate around really thinking about the more nuanced contexts. What does it really mean to push for net zero? Where are these breaking points of investment versus return on those investments? And these are discussions, for example, Hank Keating, Jane Carbone, and Michelle actually has been involved with having with both Rebecca and myself and some of our other stakeholder groups. So with that, I am going to share my screen. So bear with me while I set this up. Go into presentation mode. Okay, can everyone see this? Thumbs up? Yep, perfect. So Passive House as the platform for net zero. I think this is one of the most crucial conversations that designers and engineers, planners, and affordable housing advocates can be having right now, given what's going on at the state legislature and given what's going on at the regulatory level with the EEAC, the Energy Advisory, the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, which is the body that sets up the next 3-year budget cycle for programs like Mass Save. So I'm going to talk a little bit for pretty quickly through who MCAN is. Rebecca and I sort of have already done this, but we have 60 chapters around the around the state. And we really believe that local action is an inspiration for state level change. And so we work to support local projects focused on clean energy, community choice aggregation, climate action plans, as well as working within municipal light plant districts. We have all kinds of tools, checklists, and increasingly we are building digital advocacy tools. And we have just released one that is focused specifically on the net zero code provision in the non-amended S9 climate bill. And I was asked to come and speak tonight on what a document called the Clean Energy and Climate Plan 2030, in order to really understand that document and the implications it holds for the Commonwealth and for all of us as both professionals and advocates. It's equally important to understand what has happened with the climate bill, with Governor Baker's amendments being sent back to the legislature on Super Bowl Sunday. So these are the highlights of the climate bill pre-amendment. And it's important to note that there are some tensions between the CECP 2030 document and S9 pre-amended. So with the climate bill, really requiring emissions in 9 years from now, in 2030, to be 50% below 1990 levels, 75% below 1990 levels by the year 2040. And S9 sets limits in 5-year, not 10-year, in 5-year increments for different subsectors, including buildings, electricity, transportation, industrial processes, natural gas distribution. And in addition to those big two parts of the bill, another really robust part of the bill is adding offshore wind up to 2,400 megawatts, which is quite substantial. Equally important, however, is the codification of environmental justice communities in the state. They are currently not very well recognized, not legally, and this would be an incredible addition. And this is something MCAN has worked in close collaboration with the EJ Table, which is a coalition composed of frontline organizations. Appliance standards were also included in the climate bill. As many of you know, there was a lot of intrigue and a lack of transparency around, what the governor was really focused on in the climate bill this session after it was refiled. And consequently, there was a variety of press coverage around the professional development and real estate lobbying groups that emphasized targeted net zero as a problem area in the climate bill. So the amendments that the governor sent back to the legislature, very briefly, include revising the 2030 statewide emissions limits to be at least 45%, but not more than 50% below 1990 levels, as opposed to that minimum of 50%. And there's been a lot of press around the 45 versus 50% that may, according to one set of analysts, contribute cost the consumer. It's a consumer cost problem, Governor Baker argues. It may cost consumers $6 billion. The Acadia Center has rebutted that with its own study that shows that is a significantly overestimated consumer cost. The second amendment is revising the interim 2045 statewide emissions limit to be at least 65% and not more than 75, as opposed to a minimum of 75. So we're easing up, we're sort of relaxing these targets, which many clean energy advocates see as deeply problematic. Another amendment is calling to remove the requirements that sector-specific buildings emissions be achieved, as long as the state is in compliance with statewide emissions. So this is an incredible weakening of accountability for each of those sectors. that I mentioned in a previous slide. And lastly, one amendment would allow the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA, to set more stringent 2025 and 2030 statewide emission interim limits and sublimits based on changing circumstances. So it provides some flexibility as opposed to these more rigidly identified targets. And that is also concerning. Okay. I think for the purposes of everyone on this call, one of the most problematic amendments is the requiring that the stretch energy code no longer contain or be based on a definition of a net zero energy building. And that this new stretch energy code be incorporated into the base energy provisions of the building code no later than January 2028. And that these amendments would also allow for this code to be subject to appeals before the BBRS. And it clarifies that the existing stretch code would remain in effect, that the existing stretch energy code would remain in effect until the new stretch energy code has been implemented. That's pretty standard. However, it does loosen the requirements for developing the new stretch energy code so that it does not include the definition or is based on the definition of a net zero building. And moreover, it specifies that those communities that are designated as green communities will not lose that designation if they fail to opt into the new stretch energy code. So it's a removal of a stick. So as I mentioned, the governor and increasingly different union groups, real estate and development groups have launched a pretty aggressive misconception campaign about the net zero stretch code. And this is a quote from an article earlier last week that net zero building is an open-ended term that leaves a lot to the imagination. And I think this is important for this particular group to know. You know, the power of design and the power of Passive House from an advocacy perspective is really that we create the future that is needed. And taking on, for example, the United Association of Journeymen and Apprentices of the Plumbing, Pipe Fitting, and Sprinkler Fitting Industry, it can sound daunting, but these are the conversations that we need to be having. In response to this campaign of misinformation, MCAN has partnered with the Boston Society for Architecture and Built Environment Plus, and they have put out a call. Maybe many of you have seen this call for net zero projects with documentation of cost data. And so you can see on the right side of your screen, that is the website URL that you can drop in your project. And I really encourage you to do this. Having access to these kinds of data is really important to create an evidence-based campaign and response to their misinformation. So I encourage you to do that. As Rebecca mentioned in her presentation, our advocacy efforts right now really focus on retaining, asking legislators, asking the governor, working with our advocacy networks to retain the original stretch code language in S9, not the amended version. And really allowing those communities 3 years to opt in and thinking about, in this particular case, a net zero stretch code based in electrification, energy efficiency improvements, and on-site renewables. And I understand and I fully appreciate Michelle's comments. There may be more nuanced ways to push for a net zero stretch code provision in the climate bill. But I think making sure that our buildings do include electrification, energy efficiency, and some kind of renewables option is really important. So that's a little bit of the background about the climate bill that I think is important to then understand this other document. which is not legislative. It's really kind of a companion piece, and it outlines a series of goals. And the only way to make CECP 2030 binding is to translate the ideas in this document into legislation and into regulation, right? And so please keep that in mind, because there may be pathways in here that you all see that MCAN is just not focused on. However, to start out very broadly, the CECP 2030 is based on what they call the 4 pillars. End use energy, which is really about transitioning buildings and vehicles off of fossil fuels that Michelle was talking about. Energy efficiency and flexibility, really pursuing energy efficiency and flexibility so that decarbonization is cost effective. And 3, decarbonizing our energy supply. And that's really about producing zero and low carbon supplies to the grid. And lastly, carbon sequestration. So I don't want all of us to forget about green infrastructure as a complement to our buildings. You know, when I think of a net zero community, or more frequently a zero emissions community, it's combining open space and building performance. And so that's another interesting advocacy pathway. So this is a table lifted from the CECP 2030 plan, and this is really showing these sectors and their greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to emphasize a couple of things. First, buildings. If you see my cursor on the far right, they are a major both contributor and source of emissions reductions. And so that's why it's really crucial that clean energy and climate tech folks really work closely with designers, architects, and engineers to really innovate about how buildings can be lower emitters, zero emitters over time. And you'll notice here, the last line, the percent reduction from the 1990 compared to S9, the CECP is really focused on 45 to 48% overall GHG reduction, which stands in tension as one reason why Governor Baker kicked back the amendment to change that emissions target in the climate bill. So this just gives you a visual in terms of the sectors and their emissions reductions. Buildings way out front, you know, they're the big player, followed closely by transportation. So I want to focus on the building section of the CECP 2030 document. So the big picture, the 2050 goal, net zero emissions from the building sector by the year 2050 is going to have, they propose happen through 2 different pathways, a high electrification pathway or a decarbonized gas pathway. Okay, and in addition, CECP calls for what they call a high performance energy code. This is the language, again, that Governor Baker sent back to the legislature in his amended provisions for S9. So in terms of what can be, the document calls out actions to take by 2030, dramatically reducing buildings heated with fossil fuels. Think what Michelle was talking about, okay? And deploying heat pumps and building envelope efficiency retrofits. So it's not just new construction, it's retrofits. Both are equally important. And the goal for 2030, a million heat pumps. This is really ambitious. You can see over here on the right side of my screen, again, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions over time for both commercial and residential. And you can see residential petroleum really dropping off and starting to see this transition fuel down here, new construction natural gas. So that just kind of gives you a visual representation in terms of what the CECP modelers were thinking about. There are challenges to this. This is really hard, even though the CECP is a much weaker policy document compared to the original S9, the unamended S9. So one challenge, 3 million residential buildings and almost 1 billion square feet of commercial real estate. This is locked in, and that the building stock and heating systems, as you all know, they last a long time, making it really hard to pivot quickly to getting off of fossil fuels. And this is one reason why, these gas bans have become very popular at the local level, even though they're problematic from the state perspective. The vast majority of buildings, as you probably know, are currently heated with gas, oil, or propane. I grew up with a massive oil tank in my Victorian in Newton. It's still there. And when we think about the ecosystem of both new construction and retrofits, we need to think about the workers. We need to think about the skilled, trained laborers that can actually speed and scale up both the volume and in retrofits, the scale of those retrofits. So in particular, the HVAC industry needs more skilled laborers for install and maintenance. So what do we do? What are some of the advocacy pathways? What are some of the specific recommendations? Because there is, in case you all didn't know, until March 22nd, a comment period where you all, and you will get a link at the end of my presentation, can submit your comments on this document directly to the state. In the CECP document, it says, we need a high performance building code that actually what we are going to be recommending MCAN. The high performance building code needs to include energy efficiency. It needs to include electrification and renewables. The timeline as outlined in the CECP says by 2021, DOER proposes this code. 2022, communities may start opting in to this code. And ideally, we are recommending by 2028 that this high performance stretch code based on efficiency, electrification, and renewables becomes the new base. So the goal is to really go out and try to affect at least 50% of all new square footage constructed by 2030. And in addition to that, update the appliance standards and really eliminate these efficiency incentives for fossil fuel-based equipment. Strategy 2, which is really thinking about how can we leverage existing programs to change the market. And the key policy tool is really focusing on mass saves, energy efficiency programs. And I mentioned this earlier. So this is a regulatory pathway. And so this past, since October, Hank Keating, Michelle, and others and Jane Carbone on the call tonight have been very active in providing testimony to the EEAC, requesting more funds to incentivize retrofits, to increase electrification, as well as, again, thinking more broadly and requesting more funds that are allocated for workforce development programs for folks transitioning away from fossil fuel-based work, but also first-time college attendees. The last strategy here, which is something that MCAN is not as involved in, but many of our stakeholder and partner organizations are, is really about capping the heating fuel emissions. So by 2023, Mass DEP will develop a long-term declining emissions cap for heating fuels. So again, we want buildings to get off of fossil fuels. We don't want any more oil tanks. And this would be overseen by a commission on clean heat that is supported by an interagency task force on clean heat to be convened in May 2021. That's right around the corner. And the commission will consider utility business models, problematic, but that's okay, emissions caps, workforce development, and other issues, other groups that are part of this ecosystem. So how do you get involved? Who you all are, architects, engineers. I'm sure there are other kinds of professions represented on this call. I'm an urban planner. In terms of legislative priorities, of legislative advocacy opportunities, really, we offer really making sure that the original net zero stretch code language is retained in S9. And in addition to that, Rebecca mentioned this in her remarks, really working closely, and if you're interested in doing this, reach out to Rebecca or Hank Keating, really focusing on the net zero residential code. This is crucial. And also stepping back even further, thinking more broadly, thinking about what, let's not weaken the emissions limits. And so there is one, and this may be less relevant for this group, but really thinking about setting a strong 2025 emissions limits, and doing that in terms of increasing what is called the clean energy standard. And in the interest of time, if you want to learn more about that, just ask me a question, but I'm going to keep going. Pay attention to that Commission on Clean Heat if you're really interested in that. That's another place to get involved, as well as offer written testimony. EEAC, they are developing their final recommendations that are to be public, I think made public in April, and there'll be another opportunity to provide feedback to that entity on their specific recommendations. As I also mentioned, the CECP 2030 document is open for public review, and you can submit your comments up until March 22nd. And I encourage you all to sit down with that document. We did it as a staff and read through it section by section. It's actually quite fascinating. And just again, use that CECP 2030 document as a way to structure your own advocacy efforts. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And I have not been able to keep track of all the questions or comments in the chat, but Aaron, should I pass the microphone to Hank?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was an excellent presentation. We'll I'll try to share some of those links in the chat as well to that overview in the comments that she was mentioning that you can make. But now, yeah, we're going to toss things over to Hank, and you had an excellent transition there, as Hank will talk a little bit more about the EEAC and some of that ongoing effort. So take it away, Hank.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That was a great overview of S9 and CECP. I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail on some of those issues. So the CECP calls for DOER to, and I'm going to quote it essentially, present a new high-performance stretch energy code requiring passive house level building envelope efficiency to the BBRS in 2021 that will allow green communities to opt in starting in 2022. That is, on the face of it, it's fantastic. But the issue that's been coming up as we look at the language in S9 is that the term high performance has been substituted for net zero. And that has been completely conscious on the part of the governor. The governor and his people have wanted to totally avoid the net zero requirement. So they want DOER to produce a high performance code, which is something that falls short of net zero. That is, I think, a lobbying point, because when you talk to the people at DOER who are involved in this, they kind of understand that they're being corralled into a bit of a corner. They're not allowed to use the term net zero, but they share the same goals. So I think it's conceivable that we can either get S9 with the net zero language in it, which will change the equation, or we have to work with DOER to essentially move a high performance code toward net zero without speaking directly to net zero. The one thing I would say, add to the goals there, they're supposed to, I mean, these are very, whether it's the high performance code or a net zero code, they're supposed to give this to the BBRS this year and be able to adopt it next year. That's fantastic if it happens. The next goal is that it become base code in 2028. And I frankly find that disappointing and think we should be lobbying for that transition to happen by 2025. I don't think that if you put off that code transition to 2028, I don't think you can really meet the 2030 CECP goals. So that's something I would urge people to think about and lobby for. Now, I want to get into the weeds a little bit on the net zero code as it exists today. Right now, there are two codes that have been submitted to the BBRS. One is the AIA zero code, and the other is the EZ commercial net zero code, prepared, as was indicated earlier by Rebecca, by a consortium of people sponsored by MCAN. The one thing to stress is that's a commercial code. So the stretch code as it exists today only affects commercial buildings 100,000 square feet or larger. The new EZ code proposal would bring that way down to like buildings of 5,000 square feet or more, but still only commercial. And that leaves probably 10,000 units of housing per year between single family and multifamily that doesn't go into the commercial code. If you have a 5-story plus building that's residential, it falls under the commercial code. But if it's under that, you can build 150 units of multifamily housing in a quote unquote low-rise apartment building, and it's not covered by the stretch code. It's not covered by the new EZ commercial code. When you add up all that, you can be looking at over probably closer to 20,000 units per year that wouldn't even fall under any of these requirements. And that's why we've started work on a companion piece to the EZ commercial code, which is going to be the EZ residential code. To point out some of the challenges in this, I'm going to come back to the EZ commercial code, which was submitted in May 2020 to the BBRS. There were several objections to it. It was resubmitted to the BBRS on November 2020. And since then, it has effectively been tabled by the Energy Advisory Committee, the EAC, that advises the BBRS. And it's been tabled on for two reasons, I guess. Jurisdictional compliance requirements. They feel that even though they're optional in the EZ commercial code, that giving the stretch code communities the option of adopting additional jurisdictional requirements, including post-occupancy evaluation, benchmarking and disclosure and recommissioning, is it's not allowable by law, because they're trying to figure out, how do you have a building department responsible for things after certificate of occupancy? It's a real conundrum, and it's a conundrum that gets bigger and bigger when the community gets smaller and smaller, and you just have a building inspector in this town. How do you expect them to monitor that type of work? So that's one of their big issues on that. The other part of this that's confusing is that the BBRS also has in front of it the AIA zero code. And they have a tendency to favor that because it's already been approved by the IECC. So it comes to them as a package, and they can feel more comfortable adopting it because it comes through the IECC. The interesting thing about the legal analysis of the EZ commercial code is that the lawyers involved in that have actually said the AIA zero code is not a stretch code and therefore is not legally something that the BBRS can adopt because it doesn't require energy conservations beyond the IECC, and stretch code by legislation was intended to go beyond IECC. So the AII Zero code depends heavily on renewables, and it goes exactly to what Michelle was speaking to earlier. It doesn't focus enough on upfront energy conservation measures like passive house envelope requirements to get the load down first. So this AIA Zero code is not even supported by the BSA. There's been letters of the BSA supporting the EZ commercial code over the AIA Zero code because it doesn't go far enough. So we are furiously trying to work on a EZ residential code to go along with it. And I wish I could report all the progress we've made. I think we've uncovered a lot of the challenges. As you can imagine, we're now talking about theoretically a net zero code that covers everything from a single family house up to potentially 150 unit low-rise multi-family building. And we are digging into the issues involved there and realizing that we have to really start to differentiate those building types. And that's where you have to start getting into the question of, well, are we really saying that every single family home built in this state going forward has to be net zero? That's just not going to work. That's exactly the kind of interpretation of net zero that has the opponents up in arms, and it's exactly the kind of thing we don't want to fall into. So we do have to be careful about the way we deploy the concept of net zero, specifically when we get into this residential code covering much smaller buildings. Quickly, I'm going to go on to a quick overview of the EAC. We have submitted over five proposed programs. We've asked the EAC to renew the Passive House Incentive Program we've already got last year, to renew the training program we've already had, and then to create a Passive House Incentive Program for 1 to 4 units, create Passive House retrofit plans for 1 to 4 and 5 units plus, and create an all-electric central hot water heater incentive program to try to crack that nut that Michelle was referring to earlier. The one thing that we haven't talked about in S9, which is so important, is that it changes the cost effectiveness language that the EEC gets to use to evaluate its programs. And I think this is absolutely critical. To use the most extreme example, if we're doing a passive house retrofit program, we're talking about subsidies on the order of $30,000 to $40,000 a unit. That is not going to pass the current cost effectiveness test that's used. S9 changes that language and says that the cost effectiveness has to take into account the social value of the reduced carbon that the program will produce. So that's tremendous. And as was indicated earlier, continued advocacy before the EAC will be effective through April and even beyond as they start to roll out some of their programs. And the minute S9 gets passed, we all need to get back into writing mode to the EAC saying, remember, S9 has changed your game entirely. You now have a whole different way of producing cost effectiveness calculations. So those were the things I wanted to touch upon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hank. And thanks to Rebecca and Sarah for speaking there as well, and to Michelle for that great introduction to our program. What we're going to do now is actually break up into some discussion groups and talk about this and a few other topics. I'm actually going to try sharing my screen again one more time here. So hopefully folks can see some of the discussion topics that we have in mind. So we sent out a survey before this. Not everyone was able to fill it out, but we did get quite a few responses. So some of this is coming from the answers to that survey of things that you guys are working on, things you want to know, things you want help with, or things you have as priorities in this coming year, kind of going off of what we just talked about. We want to incorporate some of these questions into it, though feel free to discuss what comes onto your mind from this evening's discussion. So I'm going to go ahead, you can look this over while I go ahead and try to set up some breakout rooms. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the main group here. Seems like folks are still getting back. Hope it was a good discussion. What I'd like to do with the time that we have left is sort of have a group discussion. What we can do maybe is go around if anybody from any of the groups wants to kind of give some talking points or some takeaways that they had. That would be fantastic. Do I have anybody from group one that'd like to go? That was the one with Michelle.
I was just going to say, I don't know what number we were.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know if the number is set or not. So group one had Michelle in it.
Okay. Yes, I would be happy to, and please, others feel free to add on. But we had a great discussion, and I think there was a lot of optimism around new construction. And there was a real emphasis on, like, let's focus on existing buildings, which definitely is a theme that I think we're all feeling at different pieces of our worlds. But so it was sort of a question of how we incent that work, which is going to be critical because it's not inexpensive, and how we think about those operating and life cycle costs and weave that conversation in strategically with the capital needs of an existing building project, so that we're hitting on the right cylinders at the right time, and not missing opportunities. I think that was a big piece of the conversation.
That's great. Yeah, and the retrofits, I imagine, are going to come up in other groups as well. It's sort of the big missing piece in what we discussed tonight is how do we tackle existing buildings? So I'll let room 2 go. This one had looks like it had Hank in it, and others.
Yeah, I took some notes from our group, and one of the things that we just had a lively discussion, and Julie chimed in with her builder's perspective about the easy commercial code program and the residential code program, and that if those programs are not really built into the building codes, builders will not have a strong incentive to follow them. And in regards to even if they have to do like net zero off site, they're not going to benefit from the incentives that, an original builder that created the renewable energy would benefit from. So it becomes a point of, just, a loss economically that's not very attractive to the building community. And another one of our group members, Andy, did mention that, one way to kind of help change that or turn that tide is to kind of phrase a dialogue that will be more attractive to the building community, so that they can see some of the economic advantages that may exist out there to move more towards a net zero building program that we can follow.
Yeah, that's great, Anthony. I think that's a good point too. I mean, I heard, when Baker was vetoing the bill originally, he talked a lot about how this might hurt new construction, or people were concerned about that. And it wasn't coming from this group. It wasn't coming from the builders that we work with, but I guess it is coming out there. And so how do we reach these folks? and really get them to understand the benefits of this and how this, you know, in some ways can encourage new developments and not go the opposite direction. So great point. Room 3, we had Sarah, you were in room 3. Does somebody from that group want to go?
I was the person who took notes, so I can just share one unique discussion point that hasn't been mentioned before. And then I would ask that Tom Chase from New Ecology sort of provide his last summarizing thought, which was, I found very intriguing. So we had, here, let me just, sorry, I'm going to avert my eyes and look at my Google Doc here. We had a New York perspective in our group, which was very helpful, Oleg, and really emphasizing some outside of New England experiences that may inform some of our strategies, not only New York, but Philadelphia, which I had not realized this, working around state code and really focusing a local code. These larger cities really wanting to do, Boston is actually exploring this as well, wanting to be more aggressive in building higher performing buildings. We talked a little bit in terms of some of the efficiencies and cost saving efforts in order to keep costs down. However, I think it was Oleg on our breakout room that said, from his perspective, one of the biggest bottlenecks is the lack of skilled labor, sufficient number of laborers, and really, and I think this rolls back to, as Hank reiterated some of the points I was making, you know, really going to the EEAC and saying we need more funding to really invest in workforce development and training around passive house laborers. And so with that, I'm going to give the mic to Tom, who had a really interesting final thought that brought together a couple of themes we're talking about in terms of scaling up, applying residential to commercial, and sort of the dialogue between commercial and residential.
Sarah, yeah, as we were closing out and running out of time, just the thought came to me, thinking about the need for quality control and mass production, and the part of the building industry today that does that well in terms of especially like large commercial with repeated units that are produced to a very exacting standard. But the commercial code that relates to that has no air barrier requirement. On the flip side, small scale residential, where we've seen, you know, historically the most passive house development focus on air barrier, there is a code requirement that can be tightened, but a code requirement around air barriers in that small scale residential. I think there's a lot of cross-pollination there to learn from each other in terms of cost control, mass production, quality control, and meeting codes that ask both halves or many sectors of the building industry to perform.
Yeah. That's great. And it, as you were talking about, that kind of made me think of another question we didn't really address here, but how do we incorporate, or should we incorporate, prefabricated and modular construction methods into this to kind of help hit these goals? I want to give the group 4, Rebecca, you were in that group, if anybody there wants to jump in.
Yeah, thanks. We had a good small group discussion where I think a major theme that came up is that in order to really advocate effectively for passive house to the non-expert community, we need to be able to reference case studies of different kinds of passive house buildings. And really, I think, elevated in my mind the need to compile and put out into the world this database that Built Environment has been taking the lead on, and that I'm sure many folks on the call tonight have examples they could contribute of projects that they've worked on. Mike, I don't know if you want to speak at all about some of the examples that you shared with our group.
Sure, just briefly. The Guilford Village Knolls Phase 3 is a 24-unit multifamily low-income passive house building, the first certified in New Hampshire, up by Laconia. And it has a sister building next door built to building code. It operates with its PV at, I think, 6.7% of the total energy used by its sister building. And the reason we didn't get to net zero was they didn't want to do heat pump hot water heaters. So for simplicity reasons, we have resistance tanks serving every 3 or 4 units. That came in at $180 a square foot. So that's not too bad for that far north. The other thing I would say, kind of a boutique retrofit, is the Auburndale Builders Center for High Performance Design and Construction in Newton, Massachusetts. That was a retrofit of an existing concrete building, a very small concrete building, like a 4-stall garage, to the Passive House new construction standard, and it was certified net zero, energy positive by FIAS. I don't know if it's actually operating there, but I believe it is. So with these built examples, and you don't want to use the cost numbers on the second one, but certainly the first one is very encouraging, for low income housing, for the Laconia area land trust to step up and try this passive house experiment and have it succeed so well, I think speaks well for the potential.
Yeah, and I think those are great points. And the cost data that you're able to share from Gifford, and some of you have cost data from your projects, I think that's incredibly important to include in these case studies. And it's something that I know, Hank, you've been working, in advocacy with the EAC, with MassSave, to get that data shared from the projects that they're funding. But I think in terms of advocacy, it's something that we can continue to ask for when there's these incentive programs that go through. Can cost sharing and that type of data be shared as a result of that? Because we need to see that, and we need to tell others those results. We're running out of time here, so I really just want to open it up and see if folks do have some comments and things they want to share right now.
I just want to say that the builder is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to keep doing whatever work is necessary. I don't know what it looks like. And I don't know what builder training looks like, but I do think it may be project specific, but I do think that once enlightened, no one goes back. And we should figure out how to enable that enlightenment. And I don't think it's scary. I don't think it has to be scary. I really think it is empowering whatever trade is doing whatever work to do the best work that they can, to understand the job at hand and to do that. And I know it may feel like I'm veering a little off, but I can design it perfectly. And I won't, but I could theoretically, and it still has to be built right. So I do think the builder is just a huge piece, and the mindset that we don't have skilled labor, like we just need to we have skilled labor. We need to teach them the skills. We need to demonstrate the skills that we need, and we need to empower them. We need labor. And they are skilled. They just don't know what we're asking of them right now. So we just need to be clear about what we're asking. And I just want to collectively think about how we acknowledge how important that piece of the industry is.
And I just want to second that and support that with the additional concern that they are scared in some respects of this high performance and passive house unnecessarily. It does need to be simplified to a certain level, or it just needs to be brought to the trades as effectively as we can. I completely agree.
I also want to, and I'm thinking about this because Bolander, who was in my breakout group, is on the financial side.
5 minutes.
I also, I just wanted to say that we need to really talk up the wonderful aspects of passive house and this type of building that that appeal to the masses, like acoustics, great thermal comfort. It's the way everybody should be living, not just the way people should be building. because of environmental reasons. So those aspects, I just don't think get talked about enough because of the people involved in the conversation. So it's really great to have people from private equity firms attend this type of event and learn about the marketable aspects of Passive House.
John.
Yeah, I'd also like to reinforce what Michelle and I think Luke mentioned about the workforce. It's critical, and don't get me wrong, but quote, anyone can design a nice passive house. But it's impossible to get them built unless the people are trained down the line from not just the GC himself, all the way through the guys doing the caulking, the laborers essentially. And for justice purposes, it's particularly important to reach out to the minority community with training in electrical and HVAC. So they're not just the laborers on the job. And that's where the growth will be. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's something that we've been focusing on and at the same time struggling with is how do you reach a lot of these hands-on laborers who are not coming to the builder's training and the tradesperson training because they don't need that intensive of an accreditation, but they need something. And we have to figure out how to solve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a developer or architect, you have to require that people, the subs come to training, the GCs that are going to bid it, they have to come to training if they think they're going to bid it, you know? Estimators have to come to training. And if you do that as somebody that's developing these buildings, you will get them there because people will eventually be hungry enough to do this work.
Yeah.
And I think, Michelle, you're spot on. Once people learn how to do this, they're not going to do it a different way.
And there was a comment here from Sarah in the chat room. I just want to echo to everyone because it's about building partnerships with a lot of labor groups and workforce groups that in some ways we try to, but we need to do much better job of bringing them into this conversation as well. It's a good point. And there was a hand up here as well. Yes, go ahead. Oh, sorry, you're on mute here.
Okay, hi.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to add one more kind of to this equation. And I think the only state can do that. And I think the state can actually provide some big incentive to different developers. They, like to actually to move them from that point, then start moving them forward. I think that would be the only state can probably do that. Each city, large city like Boston can do that too. But it's really helpful to actually to start from practically from nothing and start moving forward. That would be a great help.
Yeah, that's a great kind of translation into this advocacy part of it as we work with the state. How do we incorporate these concepts into what we're advocating for? Margie, I just saw you had a hand up.
Hi, Aaron. I just wanted to say I've been on Zoom meetings since 9 this morning, so I'm a little blurry-eyed, but I just wanted to remind people of the importance of the materials in these passive houses because the materials roundtable discussion group that I was on this morning was talking about all of the same types of issues around equity and affordable housing. And that's going to be a key piece moving forward as far as what we put into the buildings and how it relates to indoor environmental quality and those suffering with asthma in the cities and things of that nature. So I'll be on top of that group, and I hope Passive House adopts some of the materials standards for healthy buildings.
Yeah, that's an incredibly relevant point, and it ties in, I think, to what Erica was mentioning as well about all these additional benefits that we don't talk about enough, especially in our advocacy work with the state or with the EAC or with the BVRS. We're talking a lot about energy reduction, but looking at the health benefits, the air quality benefits, the better materials, the lower embodied carbon, all these other things that are out there that people care about, but we're not necessarily talking about as much as energy reduction. So maybe that's something for us to take away in our work. Those are some good points.
The resource as well.
Sorry?
I'm available as a
Oh, great.
resource for that as well. If anyone has any information that they need on where to find products and certifications and
Excellent.
HPPs and all of that. So
Thank you, Marjorie. And thank you everyone for being here. We're over time, so I'm gonna have to shut this down here. We're so excited this discussion went over time. This was fantastic. This has been recorded, so this will be posted as a resource. I'll try to send out a summary maybe of this discussion as well. But it's excellent to have everybody here. This was a very, I think, productive evening for us. I hope it was for you guys. We'll have our newsletters going out about future events and how we're going to kind of carry this conversation forward. But for now, I'll say good night to you guys. Thanks for being here.